So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have David Conway of Nunwood. Hi, David.
Good morning, Adrian.
I understand you're on holiday and you're sitting out in the sun, so you make our listeners and readers kind of slightly jealous, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful day.
So, David, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a bit about you and a bit about the work that you do?
Sure. So my role at Nunwood is a senior partner. So I'm responsible for the work that we do on the whole field of customer experience. We're an organisation that works with some very large businesses around the world. So we work with Google and Microsoft in the US, and Woolworths and Suncorp in Australia, as well as some homegrown brands like British Airways, Royal Bank of Scotland Group, and Nationwide Building Society.
Okay.
But about 5 years ago, we were sort of asking ourselves some fairly fundamental questions, which was, who in the world delivers great experiences? And indeed, what does a great experience look like when you look at it from the perspective of the customer? Mm-hmm. And also we wanted to understand a little bit more about those companies, but in particular, we were interested in how they did it, as much as what they were able to achieve. So we started a survey and a study, which now spans 3 continents. And there's a huge database. We've got probably about 500,000, verbatim comments and case studies from over 1 million customer evaluations of some 900 brands globally. And we call that the Customer Experience Excellence Centre.
Right.
And we use that to help organisations to codify best practice and then take best practice and use it and learn from it.
Okay. Now, you just published the recent, if you like, version of this report. Can you tell us a little bit about it and the sort of the big headlines that have come out of it?
Yeah, sure. So the report that we just published is called Have a Nicer Day, and it's a play on words. It's the US analysis and a play on the sort of Have a Nice Day culture. Uh-huh. And it identifies what we can learn in customer experience terms from some of the largest brands in the US. So we interviewed some 7,500 customers of 225 US brands, and then asked them what it was about those brands that they particularly inspired them from a customer experience perspective, but also their sort of experience in terms of achieving their objectives of those organisations. And we just now, in the last couple of days, published that report.
Excellent. And does the report go into? I've seen the report, but I just wondered, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us, does the report provide some insight into what some of the leading players are doing to help them stand out and sort of stand above their competitors?
Yes, it does. It goes into quite a lot of detail, particularly around the sort of top 100 organisations in the US, and even more detail around those that are in the sort of top 15 or 20 or so. In broad terms, I think our view would be that the US is probably 2 to 3 years ahead of the UK in customer experience terms. So we quantify the experience across 6 different dimensions, and if we just do a simple analysis between the UK and the US, they're probably about 5% ahead of us in all of these sort of different dimensions, and we would guess that would take 2 or 3 years for the UK to catch up. But 4 key underlying themes, really, which I think probably are the most interesting parts of the report. So the first is that we've seen a sort of a fairly rapid resurgence in the US of the customer service, customer experience culture. So if you look back to the sort of late 80s, early 90s, and British holidaymakers going abroad for the first time to the US, they came back, sort of tailed and wowed by the service experience that they had in the US. And then as the economy in the US grew sort of fairly substantially, during the 90s, late 90s into 2000s, companies were struggling with growth and that service efforts seemed to disappear. But crash of 2008, those organisations have suddenly rediscovered the customer, and they're doing so in ever more interesting and intriguing ways. So I guess the first sort of finding is the degree to which the focus on the customer in the US has swung back and is now probably, the most important topic for the executive teams. And indeed, the second finding that we had was that the customer experience agenda is largely driven by the CEO and the executive team. And that's a difference to what we see in the UK,
right,
where often the agenda is set by the operational teams and the executive team kind of adopt it. In the US, that's very different. What we see in the US is executives that are very focused on saying that what's good for the customer is good for our business. And in the UK, sometimes we kind of compromise those two things. I guess the third area that we identified was some fairly significant developments in the field of innovation. So lots of companies doing some great things with the technologies that are now available, and use those technologies with customers, which is really quite interesting. And the the fourth area is the way they use those technologies then to drive into the whole omni-channel world. So again, in the UK, we tend to see digital as something separate. We haven't done historically. In the US, they've never really done that. They've seen that digital is just another means of reaching customers, means of extending their business model rather than doing it as something separate. And so their ability to harness and integrate the different sort of technology channels now is significantly ahead of us in the UK. So a lot to learn, I think, Adrian, from the US.
Okay, excellent. And is there any kind of particular reason why you think that the US CEOs are in front of their UK kind of counterparts in terms of driving this agenda, or is this just that UK companies or UK CEOs have got other things on their minds, or is it just that it's just a maturity and awareness kind of thing? Or what is your research telling you?
I think it's probably a combination of all three, but primarily the first. So what we see, if you look at each of the top 10, and then the CEOs of those organisations have either inherited a very strong customer focus from the previous CEOs or founders of the business.
Right.
Or it's a business with very strong values that they've sought to keep and to develop and to amplify within their organisation. So, if you look at USAA, then, some very strong leaders of that business, they came top of our survey, financial services firm.
Yeah.
Amazon, Jeff Bezos, embodies the customer in all that Amazon do. If we look at Publix, again, a very, very strong sort of founder that's, that ethos, which is making shopping a pleasure, to supermarket chain in the southern US. Yeah. Again, carries through everything that business does. If we look at organisations, like Chick-fil-A, which is a fast food joint, wouldn't think there's a lot that you can do to improve such experience there. But they're intensely focused on the customer experience, driven largely by their founder, a guy called Truett Cathy. And so you see, the history being sort of repeated today and carried forward. The essence of it, I think, is that the people in charge of these businesses are now the custodians of these sort of historic values. So they are the current keepers of the flame, as it were, but they kind of have to reignite that a little bit since 2008.
Okay. And I think that what's really interesting is, and tell me if you think I'm right here, but sometimes there's we hear all sorts of stories about leaders and famous names, whether it's Amazon or Zappos or kind of other kind of like more familiar names that get, if you like, rolled out all the time around. They are the, if you like, the customer service, customer experience kind of legends and things. And I think maybe tell me if you think this is right or not. Sometimes the people get a little bit fatigued by hearing the same names over and over again. So what I'd be really interested in to hear about as well is, you mentioned some interesting names when you were just talking then about other examples in terms of fast big movers up your leaderboard, and what have they done to drive their improvements?
Well, and I think one of the other findings is that these organisations that do get mentioned a lot, the Amazon, Zappos, USAAs, are really sort of under pressure from an emerging wave of companies that are, replicating and in some cases improving on what these, organisations do. So, some of the businesses that we identified, you probably haven't heard of in the UK, but a company called Ally Bank has done exceptionally well in our survey. Founded, only a handful of years ago. It's a digital bank, very focused on re-establishing the trust in the banking profession, and doing so, in extremely clever ways, with extremely sophisticated technology, and really moving the boundaries in terms of banking and the use of digital applications to sort of meet the needs of their customers. If we look at organisations like Chili's, again, probably not well known in this country, but they're a restaurant chain in the US who just rolled out 50,000 what they call kiosks. And a kiosk sits on your table in the restaurant, but in the restaurant allows you to order from your table, pay at your table, and whilst you're eating, it entertains the kids for you. So, very sophisticated technologies. Companies like Panera Bread, which is a sandwich and fresh bread organisation, has grown dramatically because of the quality of the customer experience that it creates. But again, and this is Panera, a very good example of organisations that don't just rest on their laurels. They became a victim of their success. They found that they had huge queues in their shops and outlets, and so they've introduced applications that allow you to order in advance, pay in advance, collect, and not have to worry about a queue. Very, very sophisticated approaches to improving the customer experience, and in particular focusing on saving the customers time. Another legend of the US, but it's worth looking at because of things they do, is Nordstrom.
Right.
There's some fantastic stories about the quality of the customer service that they deliver, but one of our respondents talked about the fact that they took back a pair of snow tyres to a Nordstrom store.
Right.
And suddenly realised after Nordstrom had accepted the tyres back that actually Nordstrom didn't sell them the tyres. They came from somewhere else and they'd forgotten. But Nordstrom didn't make a fuss about it. They just dealt with it because it was a customer they wanted to keep and encourage. So, some great stories and some, fantastic organisations that are doing some, really interesting things. Netflix is another organisation which is, emerging here in the UK. But they have a very, very, strong customer-centred vision. They had a misstep a few years ago with the way they sort of pricing their product. But apart from that, their vision of the future is extraordinary. And the technology they're using to, personalise the product so that you only see the things that you are interested in and, learning from all the things that you do is very, very advanced and very sophisticated.
Okay.
JetBlue, another organisation that... extremely good customer service. Southwest Airlines, another legend of the US, but JetBlue are fast in their heels. And, a great story about a plane that when it was stranded at Portland Airport because of weather conditions on the runway, the pilot sent out for pizzas, delivery pizzas in water, so that the passengers had something to eat while they're waiting. These organisations are really pushing the boundaries and doing great things for their customers. But what's interesting to us is that they're so close to their customers, and USAA are a really good example of this, that they understand their customers at a really deep and profound level, and that's what's driving the innovation. Customers come and go from the USAA offices. They bring them in, they listen to them, they're involved in the development of the products, and they're that close that they're constantly solving customer problems. And that closeness is also a really interesting aspect of the findings from the US survey.
And do you think is there a cultural thing that's possibly that gets in the way of some UK companies getting closer to their customers? I don't think. The US as a culture is much more open and sort of like not shy of, not backward in coming forward, as it were. Whereas the UK can be a bit more reserved. Do you think that's as a cultural element that just that plays a part, and the UK just needs to get over itself and go out and start talking to its customers, but not necessarily at arm's length?
Oh, I think that's so true. I think if you look at the US, then executives sit with customers all the time.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest turnaround stories in the US was IBM, when an incoming chief executive, got each of his executive teams to go out and speak to 5 customers and told them to get their people to go out and speak to 5 customers and then come back and tell them what the customer issues were, what the customer problems were. And we just don't see that in the UK. It's kind of like by remote control or by a little bit of distance. We tend to sort of commission research, the findings from the research team that doesn't always influence business. But that's not the case for these sort of great organisations. In USAA, they call it customer surround sound. Every aspect of the customer is, surrounding every person in the organisation, whether you're working on systems or you're in HR or whether you're on the front line talking to customers every day, then that intense focus on the customer applies to, just as equally as those that serve the customer directly. So, yeah, this line of sight to the customer, the willingness to get involved, down and dirty, as it were, with the customer, and understand on a deep level is much more prevalent in the US than in the UK.
Excellent. So, I mean, going back to your point from earlier on, you said that you reckon the UK is probably 2 to 3 years behind the US when it comes to sort of customer experience. But I guess my question would be, if you were to give some sort of top lessons or some advice to some people that might be listening to this about what they could do, what the top things they could do to, if you like, bridge that gap or to start catching up, what would you say?
Well, I'd build on that last point. Bring the customer into the room.
Right.
Bring the customer into the business. And some organisations are beginning to do that. But in the US, it's a matter of course. They have what they call listening posts, where, and particularly with social media now, there's no real excuse for not knowing what your customers are talking about. And, and they're constantly reviewing. And one organisation that we visited, it's got a digital screamer in the boardroom that says, this is what customers have said 2 minutes ago as they scan social media and review sites.
Right.
That constant sense of the customer is really important. Jeff Bezos, again, another American legend, but in the early days, he used to have an empty chair at the desk and said that, that represents the customer. This is, in the boardroom, that empty chair is where the customer's sitting to think about them every time. Dell computers in the US, every meeting starts with an agenda item that says, what will this meeting do to forward the aims and objectives of our customers? So, it's some of these things are a little symbolic, perhaps, but nonetheless, it's emblematic, really, of this sort of intense need to get really close to the customer. Often understand the customer, perhaps a little bit more than the customer understands themselves. Steve Jobs was always a great one for understanding that customers will appreciate and value what we give them because we understand them at such a deep and profound level, and we understand the technology. Bring those two things together, and we will have great products. And who's been proven to be right.
Yeah. That's great. I guess because when you talk about bringing the customer into the room and doing that, and like the seat at the table, the Jeff Bezos example. I mean, it might be emblematic, but it's a statement of intent more than anything else, and it is about changing kind of mindset and behavior. I guess this is not something that we pay sort of lip service to on a quarterly or annual kind of basis. This is something that is a day-to-day sort of thing, which is a fundamental change in how we think about our businesses and how our people sort of think about our businesses. So yeah, that's a big change and a good tip.
So that's absolutely right. But I mean, if we're ever going to catch up on the US, and indeed if we're going to survive in a global economy, then we've got to do it as well as the US do. I always said you've got to make yourself equal before you can make yourself better. And so customer listening is going to be a key part of the next sets your customer service strategy.
Well, I mean, I would go further than that and say that there's a customer listening thing, and I think that's absolutely right, and it's absolutely essential. But there's also the next step on from that, because I think that's customer listening can almost imply a degree of passivity, as it were. And actually, customer action is the real thing, because you can listen, but then you have to do something with kind of what you learn from listening.
No, that's exactly right. And there's some great examples in the report. USAA, for example, they are the very vanguard of the use of technology for banking practice, and that's because they understand their customers so deeply. They're the first bank to introduce being able to photograph checks and deposit checks without having to go to a branch.
Right.
They have applications that, if you're involved in a car accident, use your smartphone to take a picture of the scene and initiate the application directly from the accident. So that the smartphone that you have is interrogated for the weather conditions, the longitude and latitude of the accident, and the amount that you have to do is very little. And then you dictate into the phone your version of events, and that automatically initiates a claim. And that's because they understand the needs of their customers and customer desire to get things underway very quickly. So, I agree. I think it's a combination of both things. You've got to get close to customers. You've got to be intimate enough to understand needs are often unexpressed by customers.
Yeah.
But then you've got to do, the things off the back of that which solve those problems.
Fantastic. So, David, is there anything else that you'd like to add that comes out of the report that we might not have sort of covered off before I ask you my final question?
Well, the report, I think, goes into detail on lots of organisations. There's a number of sort of very, very deep and interesting case studies. But for me, often it's the sort of the stories, the vignettes that provide the insight, and the report is sort of full of those. So I think we've probably covered the main things so far.
Okay. And so my final question that I always ask is that, David, is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Well, I think I'd like people to go to the site and look at our Customer Experience Excellence Centre. So, nunwood.com, and it's free. We don't charge for the data or access to any of the analysis or the reporting. You can register if you wish to for future reports and future updates, but the site is awash with really interesting insight on what the world of customer experience looks like beyond the shores of the UK. So if I was going to shamelessly plug anything, then I'd encourage people to look at that, and I hope they'd find it useful.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, particularly when it's on your holidays. But thank you for sharing your insights and sharing the headlines from the report for us. That's been great.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, David.